So in just a moment, I'm going to call up our next set of speakers, and we're going to be talking about emerging tech. So these terms that have come up all day today around pilotitis and the challenges of pilots not going to scale. There is so much potential when it comes to what emerging tech, things like blockchain and artificial intelligence and machine learning can bring to global health, but far too many examples of projects remaining in the pilot stage. Each of our speakers who are about to join us are the counterexample. They are examples of taking pilots to scale, and as you'll hear from each of them, it's really because of partnership. So these questions will be geared toward partnership. I'd love to welcome to the stage first Peter Small. I'm going to take a step over here. So Peter recently joined Global Good at Intellectual Ventures, which is a Bill Gates-funded invention lab in Seattle, but Global Good is specifically focused on using tech for good, including in the global health space, and we'll be hearing from him about that work. Nithya Ramanathan, who is the CEO and co-founder of Nexleaf Analytics, doing fascinating work leveraging data and the Internet of Things to track, among other things, vaccine cold chain storage, so we'll learn more about that. And next is DeRisi, who is the co-president of the Zuckerberg Biohub, all about partnership. In fact, it's pretty unprecedented what they're doing, bringing together 3 major universities in the Bay Area to partner on global health technology and disease eradication. We'll learn more about that, but also about some of the work in the field that he's doing. And last but not least, Souleymane Sawadogo, who is the general manager for global health at Parsyl. And earlier we heard about supply chain work. Parsyl brands itself as the future of supply chain logistics, so we'll hear about that in a moment. So I want to dive right in, and I'm going to copy something my colleague Michael did earlier, because especially it's the afternoon and maybe people are tired from after lunch. We're going to start rapid fire. And the question I want to hear from each of you is, in this space of emerging technology and global health, there's a lot of hype. And I want to hear, what do you think is overhyped, and what do you think is undervalued? And I'll note, it doesn't have to be technology, right? We're talking about emerging technology, yes, but also about partnerships. So maybe your answer has something to do with partnership. But I'll start with Peter. We'll go quickly down the line. Emerging tech and global health, what is overhyped? What is undervalued?
Okay, so if we're honest with ourselves, we live in an exponential era, but if you're working in global health, it's linear at best. So I think what's underhyped is lean adaptive approaches.
Lean adaptive approaches, I like it. And quick note on how do you then bring that to bear at Global Good?
Well, I think increasingly our focus is on rapid prototyping and then iteration in the fields, as opposed to coming up with the perfect 5-year consultant-driven linear inevitability.
Nithya agrees. I love it. All right, Nithya, what about you? What's overhyped, what's undervalued in this space?
I'll focus on the undervalued. I think, a lot of us talk about partnership with ministries of health and government, but I think what's really undervalued is how do we really dig in and understand what is the strategy of the government? How do we first start with the problem? Like we talk about user-centered design, product development, rather than coming in with the hammer and saying, I've got a hammer, how do I really sit down and look at, okay, what are the resources the government has? What is the problem? And how do we solve that problem for the government? And we look at ministries as customers and design products for them.
Great, thank you. We'll hopefully return to some of that. Joe, would love your take on this.
Yeah, well, I'm an infectious disease guy, and so I look at things through that lens. And for me, in these last few weeks, it's all about coronavirus. I think what's undervalued from the countries and the teams that we work with are the local expertise on the ground that is connected with the patients actually coming in the door, and point of care, unbiased, sort of hypothesis-free diagnostics, where you're not just looking for one thing, but you're seeing the whole picture, and connecting that with data. Those 3 things aren't really connected well, and if you could, I think those things are undervalued.
I'm glad you brought up coronavirus, and I know there was a breakfast gathering with some members of the Bay Area Global Health Alliance talking about that very topic, so we will return to that. Thank you. And finally, Souleymane, I'd love to hear what's overhyped, what's undervalued. It doesn't have to be a technology per se.
Yeah, I guess I'm going to go with the overvalued. I think that thinking that we can sit here in San Francisco or in Geneva or Washington, design a solution that will work and solve the world problem to my perspective, is overvalued. I think that we have to really engage in learning about the problems that we're solving, engaging with the beneficiary and the community that we aim to solve their problems. So I think that this is overvalued to my perspective.
And I know you're currently based in Denver, that's where Parsyl is based, but you formerly worked with the CDC across many countries in Africa, so you can definitely speak to that experience.
Yep.
I want to ask a few questions of each of you now, and I want to start with Peter. So Devex has written before about global good at Intellectual Ventures. You're doing some really exciting work in the global health space, but you've basically spent the past 4 months leading a team that is surveying the major global causes of morbidity and mortality and looking for opportunities for technological solutions. So speaking of, emerging tech and what potential can it offer and what are the limits, that's been your job, figuring that out for the past 4 months. So I'll just ask, what have you found?
Yeah, so our focus is on primary healthcare, and I think that primary healthcare in the future in low and middle income countries will be increasingly patient-centric. It will be more proactive and it'll be more connected. And in that context, I'm super excited about connected diagnostics. And it's not a new concept, but it's one that I think is very ripe. And that is the ability to bring a point-of-care test, a cell phone, and some AI together to enable there to be, I would say, expert quality clinical decision-making in every patient's pocket.
Great. And in terms of what might be next, right? So for the past 4 months, you've been kind of exploring some opportunities. You probably can't share too much in terms of where you're going to invest your time and energy and resources, but what might we keep an eye on?
Well, one thing I'm super excited about is a point-of-care tuberculosis diagnostic,
Okay.
a urine test for lamb, which will almost certainly fall short of the sensitivity and specificity that's required. But if you add to that a cell phone reader, which takes out some of the variability, but more importantly brings in external information like the local epidemiology based on the GPS locations, and then even bringing in a phone app that allows you to diagnose a disease based on the sound of a cough, right? And that's never going to meet the diagnostic performance criteria either. But you put all of that together on a cell phone, suddenly you dip a piece of paper in a urine, you have someone cough, and boom, you've got the diagnosis of tuberculosis. I think that's an achievable vision.
I'd love to follow that one. We'll be in touch about that, I'm sure. So Nithya, I mentioned earlier that I know Nexleaf Analytics works across a number of domains. Global health is one of them. And one of the things you're doing is you're tracking data on vaccine cold chain systems. So maybe talk about some of your most exciting global health work. And since this is all about partnerships, what is the role that tech plays? Certainly your platform is all about data and insights from that data. But perhaps even more critically, what is the role that partnerships have played?
Yeah, sure. For us, partnerships are key to scale. So I'll give you a little background on vaccines. They have to be kept cold, not too hot. And it's a really complex set of partners that come together to ensure that a potent vaccine actually reaches a child's arm. So you need private sector, fridge manufacturers, temperature monitoring device manufacturers, third-party logistics providers. You need the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Finance. You need healthcare workers. You need fridge technicians. So there's just a complex set of partners. And our approach when we enter a sector is very holistic. So we're always looking at what is the entire picture and how are we going to solve this problem? And so partnerships are key. We work with all of those players. And so when we started, we were working with Medic Mobile actually in Kenya and started in 10 clinics. And the government of Kenya and the Gates Foundation took a really big risk. And so that was the very first thing we learned about partnerships. How do you really kind of transparently communicate around risk? How do you align incentives? And now that our devices are in over 15,000 clinics across 23 countries, we've learned even more how critical partnerships are, primarily first with the government. We've learned a lot about how you really learn about what are the needs of the government, how do we ensure that the data that we're collecting is actually serving the needs of the government so that the solution will sustain but also how do we start developing partnerships with the World Health Organization? How do we help them inform their standards so that not only our solution is scaling, but that we have an open ecosystem where any solution can thrive? Because ultimately, none of us is going to solve this problem alone. And so that's been really critical. And even looking to our partnership with Gavi again, all about how do you kind of align the incentives. Most recently with Google AI, that's been a really exciting partnership where now we can build on this really strong foundation of data, of networked refrigerators and clinics, and really start to explore how more sophisticated statistical analysis can actually amplify the power of this data.
Can you actually expand on that? Because I know the Google AI Impact Challenge grant, they just had a summit pretty recently here in the Bay Area. And I think there were so many interesting examples of what emerging tech really looks like in the field, if you will. So can you tell us a little bit more about specifically how AI and Google's not only financial support, but also technical support around AI, what does that mean for you in terms of impact?
Yeah, absolutely. So really what we're looking at is as you bring more data together, first of all, ensuring that countries are getting real value out of this data. So what we're focusing on is how do you kind of leverage the pattern matching and other kind of machine learning techniques in order to figure out where are we losing real vaccine potency across an entire system. There's so many factors that go into the loss of vaccine potency, but once you can do that, and once you can really quantify, here's the value of vaccines that are at risk potentially, you can actually now take that and not just look at kind of day-to-day management, but countries can actually use that to hold private sector accountable, to say, well, I'm risking $100,000 of vaccine, your service is costing me twice that, we need to change the economics of this situation. So it's honestly less about whether it's machine learning or not, and much more about once you've created these types of computational metrics, however, how do you put those tools in the government's hand, but also make sure that the government has ownership over their data, has very transparent algorithms so that they're not just trusting a black box. So there's lots of really kind of exciting things to get into there.
I love that last point. I mean, it kind of gets back to what we were saying in the beginning. It's, yes, tech is critical, and obviously all of you are doing tech-enabled work, but it goes nowhere without the partnerships that you were just outlining. So speaking of partnerships, Joe, I want to return to coronavirus. So when I think about the Chan Zuckerberg Biohub, when we talk about the lab to the field, I think about the lab, to be perfectly honest. I know a lot of your work and a lot of your day-to-day is spent in the lab together with other researchers. So tell us more about what the lab to the field, a term we often throw around, actually looks like, and about some of your recent coronavirus work.
Sure, yes. As you know, the Chan Zuckerberg Biohub is a partnership between UC Berkeley, Stanford, and UCS South, but as you mentioned, it's a little less known that we have this a lot of international partnerships and that we're trying to do this lab to the field exercise. And more specifically, we have spent a lot of time developing different kinds of unbiased molecular diagnostics with an eye towards also cheap point-of-care devices as well that are all data connected. But a lot of this technology does depend on certain kinds of compute and storage infrastructure that isn't necessarily localized in all these different places. So while the price of sequencing, something that we rely on very heavily, has dropped 500,000-fold in the last 15 years, 500,000-fold. That's a big number.
Wow, yeah.
I mean, it's getting really cheap. Everyone can do the sequencing, but not everybody can do the compute and the storage. Neither the data science expertise nor the infrastructure is there. And so we saw that gap and felt that we could fill it. And our reach out there is to produce both the compute and the storage infrastructure that could be used in the cloud and the training of local specialties in the practicing of this kind of bioscience, this kind of molecular biology, to then deploy them back into the field in their own clinics, leveraging their own local microbiology expertise. So you have people, for example, in Dhaka who are in the clinic and say, that looks unusual. We need to understand what's going on in this child. Yeah. And they can sequence it. They're not going to send the sample out to France or the US or anything. They do it themselves. But now the data and compute is taken care of. And that's the part that we've really focused on, in addition with the hardcore training, that they have to come, they have to train, and then we go back and follow them into the field and train there as well. And so in partnership with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and their Grand Challenges Explorations Program, we're now spinning up 11 different sites this year. So Bangladesh, Vietnam, Nepal, Pakistan. I just got back from Cambodia like 3 or 4 weeks ago and so on. And so Cambodia, that's a great case example in which they're really focused on vector transmission of disease. Dengue, of course, is a big deal there. And what they didn't realize is that their entire attention would be turned to Wuhan coronavirus in a moment's notice. And with one index case in the country, also working with Institut Pasteur there, all of their resources are now being devoted to quickly scale and be able to produce tests that can be done, for example, when a cruise ship docks and disembarks a bunch of people. But those countries are all on the perimeter of China, and they are under-resourced to be able to screen and surveil for a major outbreak such as the one we're experiencing now. And that kind of monitoring and surveillance is what's going to be essential if we have any hope of containing this ever-growing pandemic.
I actually was not aware of the partnership with Gates, so that's really interesting and something I want to follow. So we'll return to that if we can before we move to Q&A, but I want to bring Souleymane into this. So again, I mentioned earlier, Parsyl talks about the future of supply chain logistics. And speaking of emerging tech, big data analytics is part of how you're doing that. So can you talk about what exactly that looks like? How do big data analytics play into your model? But what role do partnerships play?
Yeah, great question. I think as Parsyl, from the beginning, we wanted to solve like one of the major challenges. And we decided from the beginning to solve the problem, bringing end-to-end visibility to the supply chain in sensitive goods, especially in the hard-to-reach population, the last mile. And our focus has been really working with Gavi and monitoring vaccines supply chain. Currently, we are working in Senegal, and what we're trying to do, we're not inventing data loggers. What we're trying to do is to re-engineer the tools that we're having to meet the needs in area of no connectivity and very challenging. Because think about it, the majority of vaccines being used is, in fact, kept at the last mile, where there have been challenges in accessing the condition of the vaccine, the quality assurance, making sure that the vaccines have been kept at the right temperature. And even if they're able to do that, they missed the piece of monitoring the temperature during the transit. So what we're trying to do is really bring end-to-end visibility in the vaccine supply chain during transit and storage, and especially with, again, an emphasis at the last mile. We are not only trying to do that, but we wanted also to improve the experiences of the healthcare workers, giving them the tools to not only ascertain that the vaccine they are inoculating to the baby is potent, but giving them some tools to actually prevent vaccine from going to waste by mitigating the risk. Because, in fact, if you go to many of these countries, they have like some guidelines, WHO guidelines that are in PDF form, but being able to digitize it and embed it to our mobile app and giving them instruction to do it actually is not only protecting the investment that we're making into the vaccine, but it's empowering the end user. And I think that we're bringing this paradigm shift to focus more on the end user and the beneficiary, because most of the time we design solutions thinking that's going to work without really taking into account the perspective of end user. We have been able also to work with them. It hasn't been easy, changing. We have to be really, I think that one of the reasons that we think that we have been able to scale in Senegal is really using the perspective of the end users. Yeah. They have a set of problems that may seem very difficult to solve, but coming and talking together, we could easily embed this solution into our solution to them. And not only we are allowing them really to feel empowered, but actually they are going to the extra mile and making things possible. For example, we have been able to challenge certain assumptions because our solution works with a mobile phone, an application on a mobile app, web app, and either a gateway. And initially, when we were going to Senegal, we have been told that people don't have Android phones because our solution requires an Android phone. I would like to invite people to challenge our assumptions. We realize currently, as I speak, we have our solution deployed at over 1,000 sites in Senegal. We have, and guess how many cell phones we gave them? Zero. We haven't given them any cell phone. We are partnering with them, they're using their own mobile phone because they see the value into using our solution. In addition to that, in some few facilities where they didn't have a compatible phone, they managed to buy Android compatible phone for the healthcare workers. All to tell you that when you have a solution, well-designed solution, agile solution that can really take into account the user and the consumer perspective, they are willing to run with it. As I speak, when we deploy our solution, we don't need to go there because it has been integrated in the ministry training schedules. They do everything. What we have to do is ship our devices to them, and they will do everything. Actually, I was talking to some of our engineers last time. People in the field in Senegal, they know our solution, they know how to use it better than some of the people that design and develop the solution here in Atlanta.
I want to end rapid fire as we began rapid fire, and then we're going to bring in some questions. And I really want to make sure we carve out time for questions. So we all see this monitor here. You have 1 minute. The question is, I really want to make sure we're delivering on the promise of this panel, which is from pilot to scale, how emerging tech can make a real impact on health. So we've heard kind of a preview from some anecdotes of what each of you are working on. We've heard your thoughts on what's overhyped, what's undervalued. I want to get to that how. What is missing? Pick a single technology if you'd like, or just talk about the space more broadly. What is missing when it comes to how emerging tech can actually get from pilot to scale? A minute each, any thoughts you have, and then we'll take a question from the audience.
Well, I think we have to look at the technology that's in their life presently, and it's a mobile phone. And then you say, what can you do with that? And that scales very rapidly. I'm a huge fan of acoustic AI. I think that there's a lot of information in the airwaves that can be filtered and used for public health good.
I'll quickly say I was just speaking with someone involved in the Google AI Impact Challenge working on acoustic AI, so I'm very interested to follow that space. Nithya.
And I think actually our acoustic monitoring platform was the basis of one of those, so I'm a big fan of that as well. So I think for us, we see healthcare workers and ministries of health as actually the next technology workers. And so I think the biggest how and the biggest opportunity that we see is really ensuring that ministries of health, ministries of finance, healthcare workers are equipped with tools to actually use data, really understand that data, and act on that data.
Great.
I would echo exactly the same thing, is leveraging that local expertise, and they become the expert user, not us. And how do we, and what are the tools that they need, and learning from them what is required to solve their local problems, not what we think they need solved.
And in terms of how we do that, it goes down to the way we design our programs?
Yes, and you have to be there.
And you have to be there.
You have to have boots on the ground.
And flows of money. I mean, we've got to incentivize this type of knowledge transfer, and because countries know what they need, but they often just, the resources aren't matched up. So.
Agreed. Great. Souleymane. How do we get from pilot to scale? Any additional insights?
I think that we have to be patient, and we shouldn't be afraid of failing. Actually, you have to look at it another way. When you trip and you fail, it's an opportunity for improvement. I think that this is it. And funders and donors really to be patient and really take the risk with startups. You know, there's great technology there. I think that at this point in time, I think that the technology that we're having can really save the world or make a difference. But we have to find the right ecosystem, the right partnership. We can't do it alone. Yeah, I think that partnership and working with locals and understanding the context really will help us to get to scale. And not only getting us to scale, will be adopted and sustainable. Because sometimes we forget about sustainability. We can have a solution, a great solution, we push because of our resources, people will accept it, push it, scale it up, but at the end of the day, it's not impactful. And health solutions takes time, the impact takes time. It's a really long-term impact.
Great, I agree. Let's bring in some audience voices here. And I know we have a question. Earlier you heard Ben Plumley mention tech for HIV. And I believe Marguerite Hanley is somewhere nearby. I was hoping to take a question from her. Hey there. So we spoke ahead of this event, and part of why I wanted to get your reaction to the panel or a question from you is, speaking of partnerships, when we look ahead, AIDS 2020 is coming to the Bay Area. And I think HIV/AIDS is a great example of, tech plays a role, but partnerships critically also play a role. And here in the Bay Area, we really have a tale of two cities when it comes to HIV, looking at Oakland versus San Francisco. So tell us a little bit about your work, if you will, at Tech for HIV, and then if you could pose a question to the panelists, would love that.
Absolutely, thank you. So Tech for HIV is the alliance between tech companies and public health institutions working to really scale existing and emerging technologies to impact the HIV response. We've heard a lot today about data and especially about really exciting emerging technologies like AI, machine learning, predictive analytics. But what we tend to ignore in all of this excitement is that there is a universe of existing off-the-shelf technologies that can make a massive impact in public health. And public health, as we know, is lagging a bit behind the private sector. We're still really very much in the 20th century, and we should be diving headlong into the 21st century because the HIV pandemic is not shrinking, it's growing. Contrary to mainstream popular belief, the pandemic is not slowing down. We do have more people living longer, healthier lives on antiretroviral treatment, but that actually means that the cost of the pandemic is shooting way up at a time when funding is flatlining and even really going down. So we have more people becoming newly infected, costs are rising. How can we affect that? Through technologies. And we're really focused on existing technologies that the private sector has been using for decades and public health has failed to implement in a really standardized, scalable way. And so that's what we're looking at leading up to AIDS 2020. How do we marry tech companies and public health institutions in a meaningful way? And historically, tech companies have supported HIV and public health really through in-kind donations. And so to bring this back a bit to the partnerships question, how can tech companies go beyond the philanthropic model and really create meaningful, mutually beneficial partnerships with HIV and public health institutions in general to impact the HIV response and try to get to zero new infections?
Great question, thank you. So how can tech go beyond the philanthropic model? And I assume each of you has probably had experience both engaging with tech very much in that traditional philanthropic model sense, but also engaging with tech companies perhaps in a more sustainable, true partnership. This is for the long-term way. So any reactions to that question? Nithya?
I can jump in there.
Great.
I think one of the partnerships that was really successful around creating shared value was a partnership we had with Intel, where a specific group at Intel was actually looking to get into the IoT space. And we had a really compelling use case. And so there was very much a shared value where they actually designed the first, second device that we deployed around the vaccine cold chain, and then that allowed them to actually take that platform and explore it for business use cases around distribution of beer or something. But it was really fantastic shared value, and one that actually we continue to replicate in a number of different scenarios.
Great example. Did anyone else want to jump in? Joe?
From a collaboration standpoint, with specific reference to HIV, the Biohub is about basic science. And our partnership, for example, we have a great new partnership with Zuckerberg General Hospital, and our goal there is cure, not prevent new infections, let's cure. And understanding the niche which latent HIV really resides in, and understanding how that niche and how that latent reservoir operates, and how to get at it, and how to kill it. So that's all I care about.
Yeah, from my perspective, I think that, yes, good point. Having spent 15 years of my time working on HIV, I have to let the audience know that actually resources that developing countries have been putting toward they're owning their response now. More and more, they have been pushed to be putting more resources toward the HIV epidemics. And I think that philanthropy is good. Charity money is good as an enabler and a conduit. I think that people have to own their response. And I don't think that people are not willing to really own their response. We have to really work with them and really transition have a pathway of transitioning to countries and individual ownership. In any place in Africa that you go, people are paying to access private healthcare because they have a trust into it. So I think that building this trust, there is opportunity for people really to own I think that people owning it, people are willing to pay for it, and that's more sustainable rather than relying on handouts from charity and philanthropists that will never be there forever.
Thank you for the question. And I see we have a question from the audience, although I'll invite a question because we haven't had enough space for that today. And then we can have just one panelist answer it very quickly.
I really appreciate that. My name is Sofie Bergqvist. I've been working a lot with purchasers of care in middle-income countries, and I see that growing quite a lot in many countries. More and more countries are moving to national purchasers and so forth. Some of them are stepping forward, asking what can we do with the innovative space of innovation in healthcare. So for small companies and for the work that you do, what can they do? So if they set up an innovation unit with the aim to support new innovation, and to be more specific, the trade-off between co-creation and partnerships, but also fair competition. Do you have any comments on that? If they are going to design a program for innovation, what should they do?
Who wants to jump in? Peter, did you want to, since you didn't get the chance to chat in the last round?
Yeah, I think, look, one of the reasons we're where we are in this linear field is because we've been obsessively focused on the public sector and supply side. I think what you're talking about is a huge opportunity to reverse that. And exactly what can be done is, I think, real genuine partnership, a willingness to work shoulder to shoulder, to take a prototype, to try it out, to give the feedback, and then to try it again and again and again till it's right.
Great answer, and we get nods of agreement. So thank you, Peter, for representing our views on that. And thank you for the great question. Well, I really love some of the points that came up, and especially the question that came from Marguerite around, yes, we're talking emerging tech, but whether we're talking established technologies we can take off the shelf or emerging tech, really it's not about the technology per se, it's about the partnerships around it. So thank you to our panelists who are all doing really amazing tech-powered work, but also really emphasize the role that partnerships play today. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.